the Joe Rogan Experience.
Of course.
I feel like there's more people that are leaning right today than ever before, and I attribute it entirely to the people on the left.
But you know, the thing that's funny about it is that most human beings, even if you just look at the United States, right, most people are not the extreme right or the extreme left.
No.
The overwhelming majority are not.
Right.
I think a lot of this stuff is also a little bit media created in the sense that it's like, let's find the most batshit crazy person on that side.
Sure.
Let's put the spotlight on them, which make everybody go like, what the fuck? Who
Yeah.
are those crazy people? And that's how, it's kind of like if you were to pick, you know, the Westboro Baptist Church and make it be representative of Christianity. It's like, it's not, you know, but
Right.
if you keep putting the spotlight there, you'll create this perception, will create a backlash, and it becomes this thing where, like, that's one of the funny things that I was noticing, because like, I really don't like political correctness. I really don't like academia. I really don't, you know, there are 10,000 of these things where I'm like, yeah, I'm completely on board with not liking some of these things. But then there's another side where, you know, I have been teaching at university since 2001.
Right.
I don't think I've seen once a case of the kind of political correctness that I see in articles in media. Not once, you know. Like, I was doing the math. I had probably maybe 11,000 students in my classes over the course of these years. And I haven't heard one person ever defend hardcore communism or make an argument, even among my colleagues, which I have issues for other reasons. That's never been one of the things. So I'm like, I keep hearing about it. I read it on papers, but why is it that when I spend, you know, that's how I make my living, I'm on college campuses all the time, I hardly ever see it. And so I'm thinking, I'm not saying that it's not true. Of course, of course, these stories are true. There's
Right.
no argument. But what I'm wondering is how much do they get blown out of proportion because you get clicks, because it makes for an interesting narrative, which then some people also live off that kind of narrative. And I'm like, how much is it something where you're putting the spotlight on a rare exception and make it the norm versus how much it's a real thing? Because, you know, you would expect, I mean, I teach in Southern California, and some of the most, you know, Santa Monica is one of the most liberal places around.
Right.
If this thing was as dominant as advertised, I should be running into it all the time, right? And I don't like that stuff. So I would be sensitive, you know, I would be paying attention, and yet I don't see it. So I'm like, what's going on here? You
That's
know?
interesting. Well, I think the instances are more frequent than ever before, but I also think if you put it into perspective and think about how many universities there are across the country, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of universities. And if you have one incident that breaks out 1 month in one place,
Exactly.
and it was about one conservative speaker that's going to give a lecture, and everybody freaks out and goes crazy, and all the people with green hair fucking bang on the windows. It becomes something that people are worried about spreading, and so I think that's one of the reasons. Because, like, I'm sure you're familiar with the story from Evergreen University, Evergreen State.
Yeah.
That was a fascinating story, and for people who are interested in it, Google Brett Weinstein and Evergreen State College, and you can listen to him on my podcast. I had him on right after it all went down. What had happened was there was a thing called the Day of Absence that had traditionally been people of color would stay home just so that people would recognize that, like, oh, when they're not there, we miss them and we miss their contributions, and they're an important part of our community. I think that's a little silly to stay home to do that, but I think it's not a bad thing for people to recognize that everybody plays a part, and if these people feel marginalized, give them a little extra juice. That's fine. But the real hardcore social justice warriors decide that's not enough. Instead, what we want is all white people to stay home. And, like, you can't do that.
Of course.
Because now you're telling people to stay home versus allowing people to stay home, in which case you miss them. This is the opposite.
Exactly.
You're telling these white people to fuck off. So Brett, who is like a fiercely progressive person, was telling people, like, you are making a mistake here. You're getting out of line. This is not the way to do it.
Right.
And then they went crazy, and they're fucking looking for him with baseball bats, and they literally kidnapped classes. They held a teacher. They held the principal or the president of the school in this room And even when they went to the bathroom, they escorted him to the restroom and then brought him back to the room. They wouldn't let people leave. The stories are amazing.
No, I mean, in fact, that stuff is complete
Right.
batshit crazy land,
Complete
right? And
batshit
that's,
crazy.
we completely agree on that. It's like,
Yeah.
that is ridiculous. That has no place anywhere. That's bullshit. That you don't do stuff like that is just same thing as like, the Jordan Peterson thing in Toronto.
Yeah.
That policy was a stupid policy, and he was right in arguing against it. So I'm not arguing that they are wrong.
No,
They're
I know,
right.
I know you're not. I
They're
know you're not.
completely right. My issue is from there to arguing that this is this super prevalent thing. It's like from one story or one story there to say instead, there's a communist conspiracy to brainwash us all. It's like, okay, we are starting from a completely understandable premise and taking it like 25 steps too far.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, but I think that what's happening is more of these unusual situations are occurring, and so people are terrified of this spreading like wildfire across the country because kids are very easily influenced, and they're also idealistic. They want to
Sure.
change the world. Maybe they grew up with a father who was an asshole and a racist, and like, fuck this, no racism, no
Sure.
fascism, and they're calling everybody a Nazi and running down the street.
But and in fact, I have it as a question, not as something I'm sure of. But what I wonder is how much of this is media fueled and how much is real. I mean,
think
that some
a
of
lot.
it is real for sure. My question is how much is some?
Well, there's most certainly media influences people, and it influences people in a bunch of different ways. It shows that you can get attention for doing certain things. It shows that other people are in support of maybe what you thought were your radical ideas,
Sure.
and that you find other radical people as well. But I mean, that's also the argument for not publishing the name of school shooters, right? It's because a lot of these people think that this is media fueled by people that are seeking attention. And I think they're probably right in a certain respect.
Yep.
But it's also just a part of who we are, and I think it makes us really consider and take into responsibility what is significant about broadcasting ideas and how much influence these ideas have on people who absorb them, people who take them in.
For sure. I think my issue with some of these things is that often it becomes a partisan thing. It becomes my guy. When your guys do that and they show those totalitarian things, then boo, bad totalitarians. When
Right.
my guys do it, I'll turn the other way and pretend it's not true. To me, in fact, it's not a one particular ideology or another. It kind of goes back to what you were saying about human nature in general. Totalitarianism, this idea that you want to control what people think their choices is horrible, regardless of who's doing it. And in that case, nobody has a monopoly on this because you have seen hardcore religious fundamentalists push totalitarianism. You have seen, atheist ideology like communism pushing
Marxism,
totalitarianism completely, right? You see people on the political left, people on the political right. Everybody it's a virus, it's a virus of the mind that when it takes over, there's this desire to squash all other choices. And I find it equally horrible regardless of who's doing it. I'm a little suspicious when the narrative becomes, look at those guys doing it, and you're only picking one side. It's like there are some guys where I see, even they desperately try to be like, no, I'm fair. Look, I pick on my... I was listening to somebody doing this thing. I think it was more right-wing oriented, and he was saying, oh, this time we are wrong. And I was like, oh, look at that. That's kind of a self-criticism. That's interesting. Let me listen. We are wrong because we are just like the left, and you should hear what the left... And then for the next half hour, he goes on about the left. And I'm like, that's not self-criticism, motherfucker.
Yeah.
That's just, you're still a partisan shill, That's like not being honest to me. And that, I think, what bugs me is when it's an ideological battle, when you want to score points, as opposed to saying, look, there are certain things that are fucked up, that are evil. Totalitarianism, regardless of which adjective is attached to it, is bad.
Yeah.
How about we agree on that? That's kind of where sometimes I feel a little sketchy in the way the narrative gets pushed, that it becomes a my tribe versus your tribe thing.
Well, you would probably know better than most because you've been teaching in universities for so long. I mean, you would see that you're on the battlefield. I think a lot of what it is a lot of what you were talking about before, about people doing horrific things, is that they're cowards and they just give in to the whims of those around them and the mob mentality. And I think that happens with the right-wing ideology that you see expressed in horrific ways, like, whether it's I mean, fill in the blank. It could be Charlottesville. It
Sure.
could be any of these horrific things that have happened where right-wing people got together and protested versus what happens with the left. I think it's a lot of it is just people wanting to be a part of a group, people wanting to be a part of this this thing that gives them, they have this feeling of being in a tribe and solidarity,
Yep.
and they go along with whatever the ideology is that tribe's pushing.
Absolutely. And that to me is such a danger because that sense of belonging is something that all human beings crave to one
Yeah.
degree or another. And so it's the same thing that make people join cults, it's the same thing that make people join some hardcore political position, it's the same thing that make people join biker gangs. It's the same mentality, right? Is we need to, us, our tribe, our group, with the same clothes, with the same ideas, we stand for, because it feels good to have other people who embrace you as one of them, who treat you well as a result. But of course, the price to pay is your individuality.